The Sunday Papers
on Off the Ball.
Then you're welcome along, Sunday Papers. I'll run you through the back pages first of all. Sunday Mirror, Reece Nelson. What a moment in your life. Oh my God, the adrenaline. So picture of him being mobbed. 97th minute, Arsenal 3, Bournemouth 2. One of those potentially decisive moments in the Premier League title race. And then we have Ten Hag, who has interesting comments ahead of Liverpool game today. For instance, the Mirror choose to go with his points on Ronaldo. I didn't lose sleep over getting rid of him. Basically, he was fairly decisive. He had to go and I had no regrets, says Ten Hag. Sunday World go with Van Dijk. We can do it. This is talking about making the top four. So Virgil van Dijk thinks Liverpool can still go all the way to top four, admittedly, but that's where they are at the moment. Sunday Independent, brilliant picture of Zinchenko. You would have, if you saw the game yesterday, all the Arsenal players ran away in different directions when the goal went in. So Zinchenko's off celebrating on his own, and the bench are running onto the pitch, and then behind him, I think Saliba's running to the crowd. So just an amazing moment yesterday at the Emirates. And beneath that, Duffy struggling for place in Kenny's squad. This is Shane Duffy, who went on loan to Fulham at the start of the season, and it looked like a very good move for him. And the week after he signed, Issa Diop signed from West Ham for £13 million, and he's made 4 league appearances across the season. So Stephen Kenny, talking to the media this week, is admitting it could be tough for Duffy to make the squad at the moment. The Sun go crazy. Wild scenes as Reece hits 97th minute winner. And they also have that Eric Ten Hag Ron KO good snooze. Again, not losing sleep over binning Ronaldo. We have the back page of the Mail on Sunday. Again, it's Zinchenko screaming, Gunners show their grit with dramatic fight back. And United star Luke Shaw praises Liverpool ahead of vital showdown. On the bottom of the Mail on Sunday back page, Mark Gallagher has a piece inside on this story. Hearn hoping to tie up May homecoming for Taylor by next week. Katie Taylor, you might have seen on her Instagram last Thursday, not in keeping with her general behaviour on social media, but she called out Eddie Hearn to get it done. Chantel Cameron is the potential opponent. Katie Taylor said she's happy to move up a weight to become a 2-weight undisputed champion, and May 20th at the 3 Arena looks most likely. So Eddie Hearn apparently likely to get this officially done next week. Both fighters very keen is the word. And then Sunday Times Sport. This time it's Reece being mobbed by teammates. Arsenal 3, Bournemouth 2. And then beneath that, Eric Ten Hag, Manchester United were a mess when I came, but not now. If I do say so myself, says Eric Ten Hag. Fair to say, we have Cliona Foley, broadcaster, journalist here in studio, as is Roy Curtis of the Sunday World. You're both very welcome. Yep. The other story on the front page of the Sunday Times, I know, Cliona, will sink your heart. FIFA tells Premier League to embrace 100-minute matches.
I thought of you straight away when I saw it. Imagine.
Football already too long. And so FIFA have said that they're going to get onto the Premier League and say, we want to see the same extra time allowed for as was the case at the World Cup. So goals, celebrations, injuries, time wasting, substitutes. The directive means, writes Martin Ziegler, that 100-minute matches often seen at the World Cup will become more common in fact, in the English leagues next season. So that's the way it's going.
And as usual, Infantino is talking nonsense, because what he's saying is that we have to have 60 minutes average, but the one thing they won't bring in is a stoppage clock. And like that would actually create more time, actually more real time. You know, the notion that you stop the celebrations. The celebration's still going to happen, in my opinion. So I don't think it's going to make any difference. We've had this before, Joe, you and I.
How long is a celebration anyway? 40 seconds.
Put a clock on the celebration.
Bureaucratic obsessions.
Yeah. These are the important issues. So front page there, 100-minute Premier League matches. A whole bunch to get through. Roy, you, like several others in the papers today, are looking at Casemiro and thinking, wow, wow, wow.
If you look at the genesis for United's renaissance, you can identify certain aspects. I think obviously Ten Hag coming in, facing down Ronaldo was a huge moment. But I think United are playing without fear or anxiety. And I think a key part of that is that they know now they have a midfielder who brings authority, leadership, security, sets standards. He's in the Jonathan Norcroft's piece in the Sunday Times this morning. A United source describes him as United's most important signing since Cantona, Casemiro. I would argue, I would make more of a comparison with Roy Keane, because I think he has stepped a less angst-ridden Roy Keane. He has stepped into that role. If you look at United's failings in recent times, their central midfield was continually lampooned for having an absence of authority, for being a shadow of what it once was. And when they signed Casemiro, I think we were all looking at 70 million for a guy in his 30s. I'd watched him a lot, but even with his back catalogue of 5 Champions Leagues, I had no idea how good he was, how rounded a player he was. You knew about the defensive security, putting his foot in, but he can really play. He's a wonderful passer of a ball. He scores key goals. And I think what's really interesting in Jonathan Northcroft's piece is it talks about Casemiro, the person, and his humility, his work ethic, and those things really are transferring through. I think if you look at a guy like Rashford and his confidence reborn, having a guy around like that, Jonathan makes the point about how, in contrast to Ronaldo, he goes out of his way to talk to the younger players, to be a father figure to them. And I think if you're a young guy in there and you see this guy with the pedigree and the trophies he has doing what he does, I love, there's a line actually from Rafa Benitez about when he played for Real Madrid while he was there, and he said he's a clever player. He stayed back and was a mirror for the players who like to go forward. He's easy to manage. You just have to put him on the pitch and trust him. He's correct. And I think those understated values are very important in a club. I think Keane was arguably the most important player in Premier League history because he set a standard at United. He didn't allow stuff to drop. That ultimately brought about his own downfall, a sort of Shakespearean tragedy type thing in the end. But for United's dominant years, it's those glue players. And Casemiro, just as Liverpool's midfield is falling apart, you have this guy who's making them better every time they play, who you say, you can see that team really going places with him as a leader, him as a conduit for the manager for the next 3 or 4 years.
It's full of great detail
That's
that
great piece,
I didn't
isn't
know
it?
about
Yeah,
at all.
yeah.
And akin to your point, Roy, Jonathan Norcroft does say that lots of Manchester United fans, beaten down by the last decade, looked at his arrival and thought, oh, here we go, another Bastian Schweinsteiger, another Alexis Sanchez, another example of United signing yesterday's stars. And it's been anything but. So there's a video, and somebody sent it to me actually, having read this Northcroft piece of the Carabao Cup, where it just showed to a degree that players are sheep. But the players are walking down the steps after picking up the trophy, and there's what looks like a disabled fan by the stairs and putting out the hand. And the players, in fairness, before Casemiro, they do give a high five, they give something. But Casemiro comes down the stairs and gives him a big hug. And all the players following Casemiro in turn give a big hug.
There's a real authenticity about him. I mean, there's a line in this which just blew me away. There is remarkable footage of Casemiro being interviewed by Real Madrid's club channel. He's handled a bottle of Yakult, the yogurt drink, and laughs, but then is overwhelmed by emotion and tears. He explains he craved it as a child, and a woman with a Yakult cart passed through his street every day. But his mother always ushered him inside because she did not have the few cents needed to buy a bottle. Yeah, I just thought that was a really beautiful image.
Very poor background.
Yeah, and really interesting. It doesn't clarify, but it looks as if he was raised solely by his mother. Certainly spent time and slept with his grandmothers and aunts because there wasn't room at home. And just, it's a really, I love a good feature that talks to lots of people and has lots of background and stuff that you haven't heard before. And while, the details really bring it home, but also there's other stuff in here, like how hard he works. Yeah. Like that's one of the things, is how hard he works and how much I thought that there's a great line from Kroos and Modric when they sent a letter when he left Real. That's just a brilliant line, and they sent him an open letter thanking, quote unquote, the best bodyguard in the world. Kroos joked, with you, even the Turkish bath was a gym, and you only allow people to lie down when it's time to do sit-ups. So he seems to have incredible charisma, incredible empathy, gets gets on with everybody. It isn't afraid to have a hard word, but well able to do it. As you said, brilliant footballer. I was reading a piece yesterday with Brian Robson, who said exactly what you were saying. That thing of, as well as, oh, I thought this guy's too old. You know, he won't be up for it. But this is a really good piece because it does all of that. And what's really interesting in it as well, of course, in terms of the business of sport, is how much Man United are being popularised in Brazil, to the point where Man United have recently opened the Portuguese language social media feed.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, isn't it? It's funny how you get a player who's just so magnificent and so pivotal. Everything starts to work, and it works at every level in every club. But it's a really, really good. Jonathan Norcroft's very good writer.
You see some of these iconic figures in sport. It says here Casemiro has an extensive gym and works with his own fitness team. LeBron James famously spends over $1 million a year. Now, I suppose it's relatively easy to do when you're earning $50 million, but spends over $1 million a year just keeping his body outside of LA Lakers stuff.
His $1 million a year is like you and me joining the gym.
Yeah, well, there's more chance of him spending $1 million a year than me joining the gym anytime soon, Joe.
It does mention, and people would have noted this at the time when he was unveiled, and he jogged over specifically to Roy Keane, who was working for Sky, and made a real beeline for him. And I thought, Casemiro, Roy Keane, how does he know him? And Northcroft's piece, again, I totally agree on the background info. In some ways, it's better than interviewing Casemiro.
Of course it is.
You get the
real.
real.
You've got so many people's views in this case.
So they say when the media staff tried to brief him before his unveiling, they discovered that Casemiro had better answers than they were ready to suggest for him. He had an in-depth knowledge of United's history. He was already talking about Cantona, Scholes and Keane. He does his homework. And to an extent,
this is equally interesting, Joe. What they're saying also the coaching, apart from the media staff, the coaching staff are amazed because when they go to sit down and talk about opposition, he comes with a load of stuff that he's done, and he's done all the homework.
Well, on that point, at home he watches football continually, at least a game a day. He uses Y-Scout to do his own analysis. He once used the platform to spot a pattern in Mbappe's play, which he exploited in a Champions League game, which is just amazing. My wife gets annoyed, but it's my work. My life is football, he says, and it quotes Ancelotti asked which Real Madrid player most likely to become a manager. He said Casemiro. In the dressing room, he hangs out with Fernandes, Martinez, Varane, Antony and Lindelof, because that's the Spanish-Portuguese speaking corner. But as you said, Roy, he's known to speak to all the younger players as well. He's working very hard on his English. And the point about his work rate, because the Schweinsteiger point he was who I thought was arriving.
Yeah.
I thought he looked full in the face.
Yeah, very much so.
I thought, here we go. 31.
Yeah.
He's going to trot around for a few years. But
it's obviously just his physical appearance.
Yeah, the work rate, because story about Casemiro's dedication. He had just won the Copa America with Brazil in 2019. On holiday with his family in Sao Paulo. They get their bags packed for a trip to Orlando. He sat down to watch Real play a friendly against Atletico Madrid in New Jersey. Real lost 7-3. Casemiro quietly separated his luggage from his family's, booked a plane to Madrid so he could begin his pre-season early. I mean, the most amazing thing about this piece is he's still married, but that does seem to be the case.
How extraordinary must it be for Ten Hag to have somebody like that come into the dressing room? I mean, essentially, Ronaldo goes out and this guy comes in, and they're absolute different personalities. One, a selfless guy who seems to be really have bought into the whole United thing, and he's having the time of his life. Perhaps he's done everything at Real Madrid, and this is maybe a chance for him to show, independent of that Madrid machine, this is the player that I am. This is the person that I am. He's a guy, you listen to all the stuff about him, as a guy you'd actually love to meet and sit down with. He just seems to have one of those infectious personalities.
And it'll crop up again in other stuff that we're looking at today. But also, he quotes Jonathan Norcroft says Brazilian journalists have spent time with him in England say they've never seen him so happy. And this thing of happiness, being happy in your job, creating happiness around you, all that's important. I think it's been said before. I remember reading about it before as well. That Neymar, he was compared to Neymar so much, but now they were very, and the media they kind of mistook him, and he had this unwanted nickname of Casemiro. Mara means arrogant in Portuguese, but but he wasn't as open in his personality, and obviously Neymar was the showman. But it's interesting how at this age of his life he is working so hard and just making everybody tick around him.
To the point, in Brazilian media, says Jonathan, there's now a debate. Actually, maybe Neymar isn't the best of his generation. So, I mean, I dare say if his English continues to improve and Harry Maguire's inevitable end comes...
Captain Casemiro.
pretty much.
Yeah. Well, he has that emotional depth, and he's on the field. He's just a natural leader.
Yeah, it was an amazing week for him. So Carabao Cup and then half-time to save the day at Old Trafford. So that's Casemiro. Roy's writing about him. Jonathan Norcross piece here full of interesting detail. Just a very quick mention, we don't have to dwell on this, but Martin Samuel does point out this situation which is brewing. It's on the next page in the Sunday Times, page 8. Just this Saudi Newcastle situation. In short, I appreciate people are increasingly finding this all a bit tiresome, but there is the Live Golf versus PGA Tour situation in courtrooms on different continents. But in the States, Yasser Al-Rumayyan and the Saudi PIF, as part of that Live Golf versus the PGA Tour situation, they have said to the judge there, well, hang on, we're part of the Saudi government. We can't be dragged into a court to be interviewed. I mean, we don't give evidence in a conventional way. We are Saudi Arabia, so we're not going into your courtroom. Whereas meanwhile, the exact same people, Rumayyan and the PIF, have said to the Premier League, and they've given legally binding assurances, we are absolutely not. We are separate.
We're nothing to do with the government.
Nothing to do with us. So both those things can't be true.
I saw that conversation started on social media during the week, and it's really going to grow now. And there's a big piece by Riyadh Al Samari in the Mail on Sunday as well. He said Premier League have been taken for fools, but what kind of mugs do they think the rest of us are?
But it just highlights the inherent hypocrisy. I mean, the Premier League long ago became a cold house for decency. You know, it's a moral wasteland. And I think if you're looking for anything that's guided by morals rather than money, you're wasting your time. Unfortunately, I mean, we can rail against it, but it's just so far advanced. The Premier League is the world's biggest sports watching vehicle, and that's essentially where it's at.
Yeah, there is a thread running through a whole host of pieces, which you both spotted and thought we'd tease out. So we have Brian O'Driscoll being interviewed in the Sunday Independent by Brendan Fanning, and he's talking about how the current Irish side are enjoying life so much under Andy Farrell. There is David Walsh in the back page of the Sunday Times. Again, he's talking about Farrell's Ireland. He's talking about Brendan McCullum's England cricket team and Scotty Scheffler. And again, in different ways, Farrell's Ireland, the English cricket team, Scotty Scheffler, they have sport in perspective and they're trying to enjoy it. For instance, he has a quote from Brendan McCullum who says, you have one crack at life. Why would you not want to enjoy it? You choose a job that you want to try and do, and it's meant to be fun along the way. There is also Mark Gallagher, who interviews Martin Carney in the Mail, and the headline there is Mayo footballers are enjoying their football under McStay. So enjoyment is the buzzword of 2023.
I'll always recall Ronan O'Gara being in a Virgin Media studio with you last year or the year before. The day he addressed his own frailties, his own anxieties in his early career, that he simply wasn't good enough. And I was blown away by the level of introspection, the emotional intelligence, the curiosity, the passion. Most of all, this willingness to open up a window to his own failings, his own anxieties. And I thought, God, if I was a player, I'd love to play for that guy. Just a guy who's so human, who understands, who gets it, who understands the emotional state. And when people talk about Andy Farrell now, human keeps coming up. His humanity, his essential decency, his willingness to allow players be adults. I think so much of sport in recent years became very, very po-faced. There was a culture of coaching egos, sometimes overwhelming dressing rooms.
Still there, I think.
It very much is still there. But if you look, Joe Smith was clearly an exceptional, world-beating coach. He achieved so much, both with Leinster and with Ireland. But the flip side was the micromanagement, the granular attention to detail, those famed Monday or Tuesday morning review sessions where people were pretty much terrified even after winning a game. And I think that wears people down after a while. I remember in a previous life working for an editor who was a great fan of creative tension, this notion of people being on edge all of the time. It was, I think, an American original concept that people would be more creative if they were pushed to the brink. And I recall personally absolutely loathing it to the point where I wasn't sleeping at night. There was no capacity to be creative because you were terrified. And then to the point that I moved on, I was just so liberated then when you were working for people who just let you be and sort of wanted you to have fun along the way. And with Andy Farrell, with the cricketers, those Scotty Scheffler quotes, which are really, really good. The Mayo footballers last week, and scoring those 4 goals, looked like people who were free to just express themselves. And I think we've all this suspicion that you can't have fun and be effective. David Walsh finishes his piece with, when referring to the three people, he says, out of that fun came performance. And I think I would hope that's sort of a benchmark for where sport can go. I've been agnostic about the Irish rugby team going to a World Cup and being successful for a long time, simply because the back catalogue and what it tells you. But you look at Farrell's team and they're losing key player after key player, and the performances aren't dipping.
Yeah.
And I think his leadership and that sense of empowering players rather than emasculating them is key to that.
I don't know if you read Enda McNulty's interview in the Irish Times yesterday with Dennis Walsh. It was just instructive, because Joe Schmidt is such an intelligent man and a brilliant man, I suspect, to work with. And it's interesting. So he must have been aware of the environment he was creating. And it's interesting that at one point Enda maybe feeds that back to him, that there is a degree of stress on the players, for want of a better word. And Schmidt's reply seemed to be, well, that's good, because we're trying to create the highest performing environment in the world.
Yeah.
And maybe, as you say, Roy, that's fine in the short term and fine over 3, 4, 5 years. But you start getting into 6 years, it seems to wear.
Yeah, but I think it also can slightly be affected by the point of the level of development that your team is at. I think that Schmidt felt that he had a team that had limited talent, and so needed to be used the most efficiently way possible. Now, Farrell ended up being part of that management team, so he would have seen what was going on there as well. But I think that he is benefiting from the depth of talent and the depth of coaching that has evolved, so that you have players now who have skills, and so you can ask them to be more creative, but you can also say to them, you can have a pint, lads, take it easy. And that is a factor, you know, when you have to go back to the Charlton era to see that in Ireland. There is this thing of happiness releasing tension, you know what I mean, and people being happy in their skins, and you do get that feeling with Farrell, and there's lots of pieces about it today, and David Walsh's one starts with that episode of Full Swing, the one on Netflix, you know, where Scheffler talks about his wife and she telling him before he went out, and if anybody's seen it, she tells him before he went out, you know, the Masters, I don't care if you lose by 10 shots, if you win, I still love you, it doesn't matter. And you know, that whole freedom of having the crack with her, and him laughing about it with the caddy and all the rest. So that is the theme really of a lot of these pieces, and it is interesting. I don't know what it was with Schmidt, because when you met Schmidt as a person, you didn't feel like he was the kind of person who would make people fearful. I think there was a control thing there, definitely, and I think maybe it was a control because he felt the team were at a particular stage in their evolution. But Farrell has benefited from a lot of things. I think, you know, we shouldn't forget that as well, because he's got this depth of talent now coming through that he can afford probably to you know, not to panic and not to close down when the injuries come and all the rest. Like, there is a level of development
definitely
there.
Built on shoulder.
Yeah, but there's a piece like that. There's a really interesting piece that kind of echoes this with Mike Brown, the former England fullback, in The Independent by Sam Daling. It's a piece from Telegraph, because it's very interesting. He's talking about sort of, you know, how things went wrong in his career, and he says the same thing about Eddie Jones, that when things went bad, he said he's a brilliant coach in terms of detailing the intensity, but the environment needs to be much more enjoyable. And he said that when things were going wrong for him, only Johnny Wilkinson, who was the kicking coach, offered a comforting shoulder. You know, so that theme recurs all the time at this level of professional sport.
With Andy Farrell, and I don't know him at all, but becoming a father at 16.
Yeah, I always say that. It's funny you say
the
that.
effect that must have had in his development as a personality, and what he became, and his understanding. He had to become an adult at 16, so he's not going to treat 25-year-olds and 30-year-olds as children. And
I always think that's an amazing thing about him. You
yeah,
know?
I mean, as I say, I don't know him, but you see a guy for 90 seconds in an interview and you can just say, this guy is a sound guy. This guy gets it. There's nothing affected. There's no attempt to be something he's not. There's no attempt to spin stuff. There's just a real authenticity about the guy. And back to what I was saying about O'Gara, I'd love to be in a dressing room with people like that. You can relate to people like that. You know they're not there for themselves. You know they have your back. They know they want things to be as good as they can be, not just for you as a player, but you as a person. Walsh has a line here where he says, it takes a special kind of fellow to stand up in that team room and say, I think we could be doing this a lot better than we have. He's talking about when Farrell took over from Smith. That is what Farrell effectively did. He wanted the players to have more fun in Ireland duty and to feel less stressed. At first, the results were disappointing, and though the new head coach continually expressed the belief that the team were going in the right direction, not many were convinced. And I think that's another thing. 2 years after everyone has done a volte-face and now believes he's the greatest ever, to have the courage of his conviction to stick with something when he had replaced something that was clearly effective.
Yeah. The Brian O'Driscoll interview, just if you're curious, he's reflecting in the main on his career. On Farrell, he says, really good person as well as a coach, great man manager. I think not many people who've met him have a bad word to say about him. What you see is what you get. He's an interesting line. He says, I always think a really good sign in a coaching setup is at dinner time and the chair beside you is free and you're happy when one of the coaches is sitting down beside you. It's a good sign of where the vibe is at in your environment.
That's so funny. That's exactly the paragraph that I marked out in the
Just
same
beg
piece
the question,
as well.
can you give us your top 10 of coaches you didn't like?
But
sitting down beside?
we've all been there. You've all been in that situation where the coach or a member of a coaching staff sits down beside you and you're going, God, what do we talk about here? But obviously that's exactly what he's saying, is that there must be that kind of a vibe going on with the Ireland team, because that's why he's raising it.
Do you think there's a generational switch going on? Because if you take Irish sport, I think like the great exemplar, obviously, and the great inspiration for so many was Roy Keane, and he did not, quote unquote, enjoy easy breezy his sport. The other icons around that time, Tiger Woods versus Scotty Scheffler. Tiger Woods did not enjoy his sport, did not smile at the crowd, did not acknowledge the crowd, was very much in himself. Lance Armstrong, I'm trying to top of the head stuff here, but around that era, he was cheating, lying and snarling his way towards Tour de France tournaments. I'm sure there are plenty of opposite examples, but
AP McCoy being another.
AP McCoy's an interesting one. Ruby Walsh, I think GAA almost fetishizes suffering. More laps,
Worse
no
than
drink.
Well,
ask them to
codes
do
of
way
conduct.
more.
I mean, it's
asking amateur players.
A lot of the squads, and having spoken to a lot of players I'd be friendly with who played 30 years ago to a very high level, just said they couldn't get involved now. It's almost like joining a religious cult at times. You have to sign up and with absolute conviction and absolutely agree to be subservient to a set of rules. And I often wonder, if you want a guy to go out and perform in front of 70,000 people, but you don't trust him to behave like an adult when he leaves a training pitch, I think one is a contradiction of the other.
Yeah.
And if there is a generational switch, I say great.
Well, that brings us, interestingly, I hadn't planned it that way, but seeing as we talk about generational switch, that's a theme in Eamon Sweeney's piece on the back page. So the Vera Pauw situation, it continues on two fronts. The first front is that she will obviously be back in the States for these two friendlies, and there's an assumption that the report into her behaviour in Houston will be raised by the media there. And the second front is that she has started taking the advice of a legal professional over in the States who has represented 200 plus coaches. Thomas Newkirk is his name, and he's quoted here in this piece, and he was in the Sunday Times last week, so certainly is talking to the media, and he is of the opinion that female coaches have been discriminated against. So Eamon Sweeney, I'd say he has taken probably the approach to this that I have as well in some respects, which is that he says, I'm inclined to believe that Vera Pauw has been traduced and slandered in America. You probably are too, he writes. And he says that she appears to us here in her dealings with the Irish media at large as a person of the highest integrity. However, he says, if she had not been in this report, which has been criticised over here, he says, chances are this report would have been hailed as a major step forward for women's sport. Those who spoke out would have been praised for their bravery. And most significantly, he says, there would have been a presumption that everyone accused in the report was guilty as charged and deserved to have their reputation tarnished. But we're not doing that because Vera Pauw's name is in there.
And she's got us to the World Cup.
Yeah, and she has denied it so vociferously, and she really has, and she's taking legal action. I'm not sure the specifics of the legal action, but she is taking legal action, and she's fighting this head on, and I mean she's going to the States for these two games. But he talks and about that generational switch, perhaps, where he says, Safeguarding players is the right thing to do, but there are times when the line between the managerial culture of elite sport and outright bullying seems to be very thin. Some people love the story about Brian Clough punching a young Roy Keane for making a mistake. Good old Cloughie. That's how you get the best out of people. And he talks about a wider cultural change. He says the current societal prevalence of a certain emotional hypersensitivity can't be denied. And he concludes by, and he goes through the charges against her and says, the idea that her presence in the same apartment block as her players constituted a threat to their mental health just seems risible. And he says, Pep Guardiola calling out Calvin Phillips' weight has been celebrated, so why can't Vera Pauw talk about the weight of her players? He says, these are delicate matters too complicated to be summed up by a simple, I believe the players, or I stand with Vera hashtag.
I mean, he's always very good on looking at both sides of the story, which I think is what makes him a good journalist, Eamon Sweeney. And he makes that point, people are much more sensitive about bullying. That's a good thing, but there are dangers for those who haven't noticed that the lights have changed. The cop onto yourselves, whingy American snowflakes response, which surfaced in some quarters here. And that's true. There was a lot of that on social media.
In defence of Pauw.
In defence of Pauw when that happened. He says that regurgitated a trope popular on the political right. Nevertheless, the current societal prevalence of a certain emotional hypersensitivity can't be denied either,
So there's every chance that the players have a point and Pauw has a point here.
Absolutely. And the one thing I would say about this, and I've spoken to her, not in any great detail, but I was interviewing her before Christmas. I had time to sit down with her and I asked her about this, and particularly about weight, because the Tyler Toland case, remember, she was critical of Tyler Toland, one of the Irish players who she didn't pick, and Tyler Toland's father said that this was one of the areas that she was too hard on her. But her obsession is with injuries and cruciate ligament injuries in women,
which are a scourge in the women's game.
Which are a scourge in the women's game. She's writing a book about it, actually. Yeah. She's very much into the sports science of it. Not everybody would agree with her views on it, but it's her worry about weight, too much weight, gaining too much weight from strength training and things, is because she thinks it overloads and it creates as things. So I think that's important just to say in the context of this. It isn't. I don't think that she was ever saying to players, you're too fat or you're too whatever. She was saying, we've got to manage your injuries, we've got to manage your physique because of injury worries, and particularly ACL. So I think people sometimes don't understand that. But he's right. If it wasn't Vera Pauw, we might all be saying, oh, absolutely right, So it's context is everything, as I always say.
Social media demands simplistic hashtag solutions to every debate. You're on one side or you are on the other. You're entrenched and whatever you do, you don't consider the other side of the story, which is a fairly pathetic way to live, and it pushes everyone to polar extreme. People become more entrenched and refuse to listen. And as he said in this, such phenomena, he was talking about stuff that's happened down the ages in American political history, are usually rooted in genuine concerns. But they can spiral into a frenzy which eventually makes little distinction between the guilty and the innocent. I suspect this is not a black and white issue. That grey area which so many people, like a flyover American state, refuse to land and consider, is where the truth of the story lies.
And it can depend on the player's personality type.
Entirely.
Primarily, I would think. So that's Eamon Sweeney on the back page of the Sunday Independent. It will be interesting to see what reception Vera Pauw receives. And it kind of comes,
and it does come back to this thing like of the happiness index as well, And even I think Bernard Jackman is also talking about togetherness in teams and how do you build it, and the death of Tom Tierney this week. He's just speaking about in that context. And you go back and you think about the Irish women's hockey team in 2008. Nobody thought this team could do anything, but the one thing that everybody remembers was they were incredibly happy together. They came out for every game smiling. There was absolutely no pressure on them, and they revelled in that happiness together. And it's difficult to do with the team, with so many people and so many personalities. It is very difficult.
I remember you talk about Tom Tierney. I remember going down to Thomond for the first game after Anthony Foley died. It was a European game against Glasgow. And what really struck me, I met Mick Galway, who was a friend of mine beforehand, and he was talking about this is a day to celebrate the tribe that we are and that coming together. And it's what you were saying about when a group form a bond, when they're compact, when they believe in each other on and off the pitch, they can achieve great things. And I think Pauw with the Irish women, just getting them to the World Cup has created that notion that they can do stuff that perhaps that belief wasn't there before, and they're empowered by that.
On, by the way, Bernard Jackman's piece, he's talking about a range of things, but just the last paragraph would jump out at you, easily missed. He talks about the passing of Tom Tierney and the funeral in Tipperary. Tom Tierney, Irish international, died suddenly at the age of 46 last week, and he says that Tom's wife, Mary, gave the most incredible eulogy I've ever heard. In it, she said to the young players that Tom was coaching in the Munster Academy, who were also in attendance, and the full Munster team were there as well. She said in the eulogy, I know that each of you will go on to do great things, and if I could ask you just one thing from my Tom, remember him with a little wink and a nod when you get there. And Bernard writes, she and Tom didn't have long to wait. One of Tom's players, Patrick Campbell, raised his arm to the sky and gave that wink for Tom after scoring a try for Munster against the Scarlets on Friday night at Musgrave Park. He will be the first of many. Tom Tierney, may you rest in peace. So it's a lovely
and he was head coach of the Irish women's team for the Rugby World Cup in 2017 as well.
Yeah. We reached out to some of those players, and some of them were too upset to talk, you know, so he had a profound effect on lots of people. Something totally different. Kerry Tyrone is on today. Why is it 12:45 by the way? Is this to get people home safely before it's dark? Is that the logic?
I was at our colleague Conor McKeown's 40th birthday celebrations.
Don't out him last night. He's 37. No?
He actually said to me, said to me as I was leaving very early, he said, make sure to name check me tomorrow. But there was another individual who shall remain nameless who had to cover that Kerry Tyrone game this morning, who was very disenchanted about heading home at about 6:30 from a 40th birthday.
Is the logic to get people home in the light?
I think that's exactly what it is.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of TV games on today, so as well.
Well, it's actually a great armchair day in that Kerry Tyrone morphs into Mayo Roscommon, morphs into Man United, Liverpool morphs into the last round of the golf with Rory very much in contention.
There's something sad about us sitting on the couch eating all day watching sport.
Speak for yourself, Joe.
Right, that is my life. That's my life. Oh my God, I'm not.
Well, Casemiro does a lot of it as well. That's the only consolation, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Tyrone, Kerry, obviously, like if people don't know the history, you know, they
like each other, right?
They love each other, these two, and it's it's relatively recent. And I suppose the big question I still don't understand is why did so many Tyrone players quit after winning the All Ireland 2 years ago?
Yeah, any theory on that?
I'm absolutely amazed by it. I still can't get my head around it. I have seen no clear understanding of it. But it's interesting to see, will this game today bring out a bit of the old swagger in it? Sean McGoldrick has a really good piece in Sunday World, gives all the results and all the history between them. But I mean, we know the most recent stuff has been fascinating. But Mark O'Shea, who has a column in the Mail, is very good on it, and he's suggesting that David Clifford might just get to see what his football hell looks like today, because he describes their previous meetings and that brilliant enmity that developed between them in Mickey Hart's time. You know, and was only conquered really when Jack came back. But this is the day which he says best of enemies need to end this shadow boxing. But he has great insight into Brian McGuigan and Ricey McMenamin shouting at him on the pitch, and just you get the sense of it, like they really hate each other during those years.
He seems to have been stuck with Ryan McMenamin in a drugs test.
That's right.
The 05 final. The two of them are there, and
he's trying to produce a sample.
He can hear the Tyrone dressing room belting out Aaron Levine. And he said, if I could just pee right now, I'd give you my Munster medal to do it. But the unbelievable line towards the end of it, this should be the headline. So he's reflecting on the days, and he says, he's talking about how this is the most open championship, by the way, in a generation. Dublin, Mayo, Galway, Armagh, Tyrone, Derry will believe they can win it. He says, that brings me back to the old days with Tyrone. Brian McGuigan roaring in my face, you'll never fucking beat us. Imagine screaming that in someone's face.
But I love the way he gets in a little dig then at the end as well, because about the fifth last paragraph it is. But then Tyrone, back in the day when they were tormenting us, never could do back to back.
That was their obsession in that decade.
That was a strange thing about that Tyrone team.
Yeah.
03, 05, 08, wasn't it?
Yeah. Amazing, whereas Kerry did back to back in the middle of that.
And are now looking to
But
do it again.
they were soft All Irelands against Mayo.
The most
Bryce
animated.
McMenamin's going to burst into the room any minute. I'm getting scared.
The most animated I ever saw Paul Galvin was after that qualifier game in Killarney.
Killarney, the one in Killarney.
And Kerry, who were sort of dismissive of people who have less than 6 All-Ireland medals, celebrated a mid-season game like they'd won the 10 in a row.
Yeah.
And you really got to understand the depth of feeling. There's a lot of stuff today about Liverpool and Manchester United measuring each other by the extent of the other's misery. And there was a little bit of that went on. And that famous picture of Darragh O'Shea surrounded as he landed by the Kerry man was sort of an iconic picture of how that relationship was. The guys who regarded themselves as the natural football aristocrats being suffocated by this new demonic force as they saw them from Ulster. But I think today's game is actually far more important for Tyrone because they have just fallen off the edge of a cliff.
By the way, I don't know if Mark O'Shea writes the column himself or if it's ghostwritten, but kudos to whoever writes it.
It's very good.
If you, here's a sentence that this is Mark O'Shea, because sometimes you read a column and you're like, well, that's not
the
you.
voice.
So he's talking about Clifford here, and obviously there'll be the dark arts up in Omagh, and he says, in fairness to the Fossa Club man, for all the times he's had his tail pulled, he rarely snaps and certainly won't be bullied. Like having his tail pulled, it's such an O'Shea kind of a...
It is, isn't it?
way of talking about it. So
it is a thing about Clifford. He can look after himself as well.
And he doesn't.
Temper.
He has a temper, and I like that about him.
Yeah, well, that's it. It's such a big game, and it's great to see that people are just kind of heightening this thing. But it is interesting to see, as you said, will there be a response from Tyrone today? Because if there isn't, they're in serious trouble.
I tell you what's interesting about the league. A lot of people said this league would be low key, that with running into the championship, that it was phony war. The crowds have been huge. It just shows the hunger. I went with a couple of friends on a busman's down to the Dublin Cork game 2 weeks ago, and the number of dubs that travelled for the thing, I was absolutely astounded by it. But it just shows the appetite after that long break. And I
think, there's a degree of let's strike.
I really do,
I also think there's an element of Dublin being in Division 2 and teams getting a chance to have a crack at them as well.
Absolutely.
Like Derry last night was phenomenal.
Mayo crowds
oh
are
my
off the
God.
charts though.
As they always are. Armagh have been getting huge home crowds.
Armagh getting great crowds,
Cork Limerick hurling game in Páirc Uí Chaoimh, I think there were 24,000 in it. I mean, just absurd numbers for this time of the year. Yeah, exactly.
Waste of time, really.
Exactly.
And you'd wonder, is it because there was such a gap as well? The championship finished so early last year. There's a massive vacuum
like the split
there in the
season,
winter now.
The club players are rightfully getting their time. But the reality is it doesn't engage the masses. It's the people directly connected with it. And
it never will, I would argue.
It never will. And I think it's a real issue for the GAA when kids are looking at packed Premier League stadiums and they're looking at packed rugby stadia, and then the big club game of the week is played at Thurles and there's 1,200 people at it. There is no perfect solution, and I'm not suggesting that there is.
But it's a pity.
It is a pity, yeah. And stars, when Jack McCaffrey came on in Cork 2 weeks ago, the buzz around the crowd, it was like suddenly a dull winter game turned into the Super Bowl. This guy just electrified the place. And so many of the GA stars are invisible off the pitch. You can't demand of amateur players. I fully get that. But again, it's back to your point about this sort of delighting in austerity and staying away from the public eye. And there's so many fascinating stories. We're getting Casemiro's story today. So many fascinating GA stories untold.
It's again, it's totally their right. You respect it. But we have an ongoing joke here when we try and reach out to a GA player for an interview, and it's amazing. They all reply with, "I'm just keeping the head down at the moment." So we say keeping the head down merchant. Yeah,
And I mean, Roy and I started working. We started near where you'd ring a guy at work because they didn't have mobile phones then. You'd ring him at work and they'd take the call. They'd take the call. They go, hold on a sec. They'd tell whoever they were working to go on ahead, and then they'd chat to you. Then you got their mobile phone numbers. Then you got into that era where you could directly contact them. Now everything has to go through official channels.
I remember being on the 1990 International Rules Series tour of Australia, and the access to players who you spent unbelievable time. There's one guy, and he won't mind me mentioning his name, Stephen O'Brien, the Cork footballer, who subsequently became one of my closest friends. I arranged to interview him of a day, and he said, come on up to the room. And an empty minibar later, we hadn't turned on a recorder, And there was just that trust, that excess, but there was none of this culture of paranoia which seems to pervade now.
Which is created, I think, by managers, who are just paranoid. And as I always said, what are they going to tell anybody? They're never going to reveal tactical stuff. And
people
also
are not that
the
interested in the tactical stuff
and
anyway.
the level of education, in the GA is incredible. In dealing with incredibly smart people, men and women. And you say, if you don't trust them, you said it earlier, which I always come back to that one as well. If you don't trust them to talk to a journalist, how are you trust them out in the field? And if you trust them out in the field, then you should trust them everywhere else. That's always my thing,
We had that wonderful experience that happens in the media where some colleagues of mine were WhatsApping me in the morning saying, do you see who's in the Sunday Independent? I was like, who? And they said, the bloke we're doing a big interview with on Tuesday. So these things happen. Justin Campbell is a former Galway hurler, and we are due to speak to him next week. But there's a 2-page spread with him in the Sunday Independent if you want to get there first.
Yeah, it's a lovely
really
piece.
interesting.
Very interesting piece with Dermot Crowe.
So he played for Galway. If you were a hurling fan in the 90s, Justin Campbell, maverick, swashbuckling forward, as Dermot Crowe describes him. 1993 off the bench in the All-Ireland final against Kilkenny. Played against that Wexford team in 96. He went to Chicago. He came back at the age of 26 years of age, and he had his issues with alcohol addiction, and the genesis being, it's horrific the way he talks about it, the deaths of both his mother when he was 14 and his father as well.
When he was 8.
Yeah, so you just can't imagine. And when he was passing away he was 14 when his mother was diagnosed with cancer, 17 he had counselling, but his mother put him into Garbly College as a boarder and just begged them kind of to get him a good leaving cert. So a lot of unresolved grief there, and struggled with addiction, and overcame it, went back to the Rutland Centre and became a counsellor, and now works with people struggling with addiction. And I suspect the line caught both of your eyes, but didn't surprise you either. He said the addiction substance of choice has shifted across the generations. Cocaine muscling in on old drinking ground. And he said it's very strange now to find somebody coming in the doors over just alcohol. It would be a crossover, maybe 4 or 5 pints, then cocaine would kick in. So the alcohol would be a gateway. All the research for treatment centres shows cocaine is more commonly used, is up by 33% amongst people seeking help. So we can presume it's up by a lot more of those not seeking help. Clients are telling me you could have 4 or 5 people in any pub dealing it at any given time. What shocked me is the availability, that in rural villages cocaine is pretty plentiful. If you want it, you can get it quickly.
Yeah, I wondered, one of the interesting things about Justin is that he's somebody who's been contributing to the GA on their health and wellbeing committee, which is really important, I think, as well. It's really important that, the experiences of people and the experience of people who are dealing with young people in a real way, not down at county training when they're all behaving perfectly. Is really important that the GA hear that and that they know what's going on as well. Just really good piece. I mean, I had no idea that his own life had been so tragic. Like, he came back from Chicago and signed himself into the Rutland Centre at 26. That's how bad things were. And again, not enough treatment centres in this country. It's an old bugbear of mine, but it's the most commonly used drug still is alcohol, and there's the public treatment centres are just a scandalous lack of help for people with it. But he went back, he did counselling, he never gone to college. He laughs because he ended up doing a postgrad in Trinity, and he said he could never imagined it. But there's a few lovely light lines in it as well. And he says, when we're talking about how you treat players and kids, his mother locked him in the room once, and he's laughing and saying to himself, it was her only way to get me in there to do some homework. And when she went up, the curtains were blown and the window, he jumped from the top story down, and he was gone to her.
Yeah.
And he said that's all he was interested in then was hurling.
She came upstairs because she was feeling sorry for him.
Yeah.
It's like, I better let him out.
Both my parents lived until I was into my 40s, and my mother until I was into my 50s. And they were certainly the people who shaped who I became, and people who sort of bled love and sacrificed so that you could achieve what they never had a chance of achieving. And I often thought, had they not been there, had you lost them at an early age, the type of person you might have become, the the depth of loneliness, the absence of that natural love that a parent shows for a child, not to have that through your formative years, the hollowness that must leave in a person's soul. And he speaks here, he says, as a human being, I suppose you will avoid pain as much as you can. That is the normal thing to do. And he goes on to say, this is going to happen to all of us at some level. And we don't have a conversation too often about our own death or when it's going to happen or not. I know it's deep stuff and it's existential stuff, but you can see how people retreat from pain, and you will retreat to anything that sort of disguises your true feelings, I suppose.
Well, there's a payoff in every behaviour.
Yeah, and as he said, grief is universal. It's going to come to us all at some stage in our lives, and the availability of people to help deal with it and to deal with and then on the other side to deal with addictions, and we know cocaine is becoming a scourge as well. But it's a very good piece by Dermot.
I feel very out of touch with the cocaine thing. I mean, it's not to say it wasn't going on. So I'm 37 now. I mean, Celtic Tiger, the way it is in my memory, is apparently it was everywhere in champagne glasses clinking. That wasn't my experience as a broke student, I have to say. But I definitely feel of a generation, certainly my 20, 30 lads that you're routinely-ish friendly with in that period of your life, I very much feel it was like alcohol and too much alcohol. But I don't remember a big, or when are we in to do our cocaine atmosphere?
I'm 54. It would hardly be a breach of the Official Secrets Act to say I spend quite a bit of time in pubs. I just love old Dublin city centre pubs. And this stuff about, 4 or 5 people selling it, maybe they just don't see me as the target audience, because I've never, ever, ever being approached in a pub, or as you say, I understand that, but I would, at a younger age, I was also in the pubs through that Celtic Tiger era. Guys I played football with, guys I played GA with, guys I played basketball with. We'd go out collectively, and I actually have only seen cocaine once in my life.
Never seen it, actually.
Me neither. I think that it is more prominent in sporting circles because of it doesn't put on weight. Yeah. And I think that is a factor. Okay. I think there's a
that
thing
increasing obsession with image.
In my era, lads and girls drank beer, and you know what I mean. But people are actually so body conscious now, and so health conscious, that cocaine is seen as an upper that you're not going to have any major counter effects from, and also the price of it and the street value of it and the amount of it flooding into this country. Serious practice.
Towards the tail end of COVID, outside for dinner on a street not far from here, city centre, and. There were 4 of us having dinner, and like 15 yards in the middle of the street to our left was somebody just took out a little metallic, it's like obviously I hold it and just sniffed it in the street, but like the middle of the street, kind of facing everybody, and it was. Well, I have
a friend who was on her way to a Champions League match, and people, she said, were sniffing it off in the plane before they'd left Dublin Airport.
Yeah. Well, do you remember Trafalgar Square?
Yeah,
every time Sky Sports News tried to just do they were like, oh, there's someone else doing white substance, let's quickly get the hell away from that.
Yeah.
So it's out there.
We've lived sheltered and protected.
I think.
Just a different era as well. But good to hear from somebody who's working at the coalface, and he said he has GA players, obviously, because he has a private business now, but not just GA players, it's people from all walks of life and other sports as well. But I think it is important that somebody like him as well has given great input into the GA's Health and Wellbeing Committee, that they are looking at stuff like this and that they're in touch with what is real.
Cliona, we might just finish up with your piece, page 7 of the Sunday Independent. Women's League of Ireland is up and running once again.
Yeah, there's a great picture actually in the Sunday World today of and who was it scoring the winner for Shamrock Rovers yesterday, who used to play for Piedmont. You'll help me out in a minute now, but it struck me that Anya Gorman scoring for a new club. Great action picture and great good reporting. It just struck me, and I had heard that the very first Women's League of Ireland was in 1973, the very first league. Right. And some of those players and other players that played in Limerick, which was a real hotbed for women's football at the time, got together recently to celebrate their win for 50 years. And so I talked to some of them, but more importantly, I talked to the man who had who was there who helped them all get there. And Frank Junior Keane is a famous character he's 83 now, and most of them are in their 60s, and they got together for a brilliant reunion recently. And it's just I just wanted to try and mark it, because we see, when I was driving in today, there was a big billboard with the Women's League of Ireland on it because it kicked off this weekend, and I just thought 50 years ago it would be hard for them to believe what happened then, and it's hard for them now to see what's happening now.
Hasn't it been the most remarkable 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, the FAI deserve great credit. I think the Sky sponsorship has been a factor as well, but there has been a huge ramp up in the publicity and the marketing of the women's local game. And of course, I think with the understanding as well that this is the league that produced so many of these players that are now going to be playing in the World Cup, so that's a factor. But there were brilliant stories here, just brilliant stories. He's still... It's just such a gorgeous man. I interviewed him. So Frank Junior Keane is his name. He was the coach. Okay. He was the guy. He used to coach kids team in Ballinanty, and the girls used to wander over. A few girls would wander over and play, and he just said, "Come on in, play." And then he had this Ballinanty girls team who nobody could beat. And then they evolved eventually. The factory leagues. Women started playing in factory leagues back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And this was the very start. League of Ireland. The WFAI was actually founded in 1973, so it was the very first League of Ireland, Women's League of Ireland. Still going strong. He was at this reunion, but brilliant stories. Like the gear used to swamp them. Somebody's mother brought back a set of gear from American football. They wore them as dresses. They were like dresses on them. And then somebody else's mother went and made them a set of gear, customised, and they were pink. And there's a great line. He said to me, teams would see them coming out in pink and that we'll run rings around them, and they beat everybody wearing pink, and he just thought that was so funny. But they were sensational. They won the first League of Ireland, the second League of Ireland. They won the first Women's FAI Cup in 1975. So I just talked to them. But his delight at what's happening now was fantastic as well.
I bet it is.
He just said it's magic.
When you talk about that past 5 years, I've worked in sports journalism for 35 years. I'd never been to a women's football match. I'd never been to a women's rugby match. I think I'd maybe been at 2 women's GA games. You and I would have covered the basketball back in the day, and they were sort of standard bearers in that great Blarney women's team. There was a guy called Dommy Mullins who fits that narrative very much. But I wasn't sort of being consciously discriminatory. It just never occurred to me to go to these games. And I got so engaged by the Dublin women's football team, and then that rivalries with Cork and then with Meath. And you've come to see them as stuff that you're not watching because you're sort of compelled to by some equality agenda. But that's actually very good entertainment in its own right.
Yeah.
And Jackie McCarthy O'Brien, who's an amazing woman in Limerick, she was the first coloured woman to play international soccer and rugby for Ireland. But she's been invited to this thing by Sky that's on Wednesday for International Women's Day, and she said to me, Junior should have got my ticket. So, but he was brilliant, and he was saying, I said to him, do you watch much women's football now? At 83, he says, I watch. He said, watch it. He said, sure, I'm watching the Chelsea women and the Arsenal women and the Man City women on the TV. He said they come up all the time, and he just loved women's football. He never saw any difference between a young fella. He was big into schoolboy soccer down there with Wembley Rovers. Never saw any difference. He took them. They went to one time into there was a tour. The Charleville Cheese Festival had a women's football tournament. So they took them.
I'm going. When's it on again?
In the 70s.
You're right when you say we've lived sheltered lives, by the way.
So he took them across the border for a little cross-border raid.
What was the cocaine scene there?
Yeah. well, they discovered when they got there that it was a Gaelic football tournament.
Okay.
So he just simply said to them, girls, that's even easier. Pick it up and kick it up. And they won that as well. And he said to me, we've got no cheese. He said, we've got a few trophies, all right. But just a fantastic man. And my angle on this is Irish women's soccer owes a lot to men like him as well as women.
Completely unheralded.
And
never
so
heard
much
of them.
women's sport owes so much to men, and sometimes they don't get a mention.
Yeah. It's funny, I was walking through St. Anne's the other day, and the vast majority of all the organised sports teams were female, all under 12s and younger.
Yeah.
There's going to be such a quantum leap in standard participation. And I was telling the person with me that, so when I played soccer, 90s, which increasingly starting to sound like a long time ago, it really doesn't feel a long time ago. We would have considered ourselves very modern, and there was a girl who played on our football team until we were under 11 or under 12, and then she was just told, oh no, like that's done now. And it was just seen as so normal that like you're just cast aside.
Yeah.
Don't know if she ever played football again. She was really good, and it was just like, oh,
Just didn't matter.
No, and like it's and
And as I said, this was a stage where it wasn't even that girls were playing with boys up to a certain age. They weren't playing football because they weren't seeing opportunities to play it. But in Ballinanty, if you were a little girl and you saw the boys out in the green playing and you went over, he said, come on and play it. And actually Jackie O'Brien Jackie McCarthy was running, she was jogging around the field when she was 11. She played League of Ireland when she was 11, which is mad. But she was jogging around the field and the ball came across her and she kicked it back and he ran over and he said, you've got a great right foot, come on in and join us.
Yeah.
And that was his attitude. Fantastic.
I remember the girl playing with us. It was almost like a kind of funny curiosity. Even the adults, I'd say, were like, oh, look at this, she plays too, kind of it. And that was that probably.
I'd never underestimate the Katie Taylor factor in opening doors. I just think her success was in boxing, but obviously she was a hugely accomplished football player as well. And I just think it made it trendy. It made it cool for a lot of young girls to follow.
Well, she was successful as well. And because she was successful, she got exposure. And because she was successful. I mean, Brian O'Driscoll has said this before. For men to get media coverage, they can be good. But women have to be brilliant to get media coverage. And there is that angle.
Counterpoint, though, I accept Katie's great. I just think society's changed, because the counterpoint to Katie would be, well, we all marvelled at Sonia.
Sonia, I was actually thinking it as I was talking it, and it was the perfect storm of a brilliant athlete coming along at the time that attitudes were completely being transformed. And just to have such an inspirational, such a successful athlete at that perfect moment just opened doors that had previously been padlocked, really.
Yeah, but also she was in an equal opportunity sport, and she got equal coverage. I always say that there was never a problem for women's coverage in individual sports if you were good. Team sport was the problem, because women were always seen as an inferior product to the male side of it, and that has changed. And that's why somebody like Katie McCabe now, you can see the young kids, they just, it's with Denise Sullivan or Katie McCabe, and they see her playing, see her playing for Arsenal on TV, and now she is an absolute superstar.
I didn't see, was it the Late on Friday, was Amber Barrett?
Amber Barrett was on it, and actually,
a friend of mine was talking last night about it and said it was just mind-blowing how good she was. She was really good, and there were some interviews with her in the papers over the weekend, and there's actually also the Sunday Business Post today Emmett Ryan has a good interview with Amy Broadhurst as well, and just to see her like that on the front cover of a magazine, do you know what I mean? And that's
cool.
all part of it. She looks really cool. Yeah, she looks cool.
It's important.
That's really important. Yeah.
We're out of time. Thank you both so much. Cliona Foley, broadcaster, journalist, Roy Curtis of the Sunday World. Pleasure, guys. We'll do it again soon.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks, Joe.